Before we dive into today's intense story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know how far this story travels. And if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Today's story will keep you on the edge of your seat from start to finish, so stay with me till the end, because the twist is one you'll never forget. You never know how quickly an ordinary day can twist into something unthinkable. How a calm walk beneath the trees can turn into a nightmare that leaves you gasping for air, praying for rescue, and holding on to the faintest spark of hope. It began on a quiet afternoon when the air felt still. The leaves rustled lazily, and the sun filtered through the branches like nothing could possibly disturb the peace. But for Alicia, a woman known for her strength and resilience, that serenity was brutally shattered when shadows emerged from the woods. She wasn't naive, and she wasn't weak, but no one can ever truly prepare for the moment when danger surrounds you and the world turns against you. The gang moved with predatory ease, their boots crunching on dry twigs, their voices dripping, with arrogance and menace. They didn't stumble upon her by accident. They had been watching, following, waiting for the perfect chance to strike. They wanted power, control, and above all, they wanted to break the spirit of someone who carried herself with pride. They mocked her skin, her confidence, her independence, and with ropes rough enough to cut into flesh, they tied her against the cold trunk of an old oak tree. Bark scraped her arms, splinters dug into her skin, and every knot tightened like a cruel reminder that she was at their mercy. The forest around her, which just minutes ago felt alive and welcoming, now seemed suffocating. Every sound of birdsong drowned beneath the laughter of men who believed they owned the moment. Yet even as fear clawed at her, Alicia's mind reached for the one lifeline she still had, the phone hidden in her jacket pocket, pressed against her hip, its screen still glowing faintly, its power representing the razor-thin line between despair and salvation. They thought they had stripped her of everything, but they underestimated the determination in her heart. Her fingers, trembling yet focused, brushed against the device, sliding it out slowly, quietly, her breath shallow enough not to draw attention. Every second stretched into eternity as she prayed they wouldn't notice. Prayed that her final chance wouldn't be ripped away before it could reach the one man in the world who would never let harm touch her without consequence. Her husband, a man whose very name among his brothers in arms carried the weight of legends, a soldier shaped by shadows and steel, a protector forged by missions most civilians could never imagine. He wasn't just military. He was Delta Force, the kind of man who could turn the tide of a battlefield with sheer will. She pressed the call button, a whisper of movement, a desperate gamble, and with her heart pounding louder than the mocking voices around her, she waited for that single connection that could mean the difference between a nightmare that consumed her and a rescue that would echo like thunder through the trees. The faint click of the call connecting was drowned beneath the gang's laughter. But to Alicia, it sounded like a drumbeat of salvation, a signal that the nightmare unfolding around her might yet meet its reckoning. Her throat tightened, her lips trembling, but she didn't dare speak a word, not with rough hands gripping her arms and cruel eyes scanning her every twitch. She didn't need to. One breath, one strained exhale into the microphone, was all it took. On the other end of the line, hundreds of miles away but attuned like a hawk to every sound, her husband paused mid-step, his instincts sharpening like a blade drawn from its sheath. He had just finished a grueling training session, sweat dripping down his brow, muscles taut with the kind of readiness only years in Delta could build. The phone vibrated in his pocket, and though most calls could wait, this one carried her name, his wife, his anchor, his reason for believing in something beyond the battlefield. He answered without hesitation, and the silence that met him was louder than any explosion he'd endured in combat. He heard nothing at first but the rustle of wind, the muffled shouts of unfamiliar voices, and beneath it all, the faint hitch of her breath, the kind she tried to stifle when fear gnawed at. Her but resolve kept her standing. That was enough. Every fiber in his body snapped to attention, his blood running cold yet steady with purpose. "Alicia?" he whispered. The name carried not just with love, but with a soldier's dread. Then, in the distance, a harsh laugh cut through the air. A man's voice barking something vile, followed by the sound of a slap and the muffled cry that tore at him like shrapnel ripping through flesh. He didn't need explanations. He didn't need words. He knew. Somewhere out there, the woman who had stood by him through deployments, through sleepless nights, through the kind of silence only warriors know, she was in the clutches of men who thought they could break her. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening around the phone as a storm of memories and instincts fused together. He thought of the vows they had spoken, the promises carved deeper than ink or stone, the countless nights when she reminded him he wasn't just a weapon, but a man worth loving. They thought they tied her to a tree, but in truth, they had lit a fuse on a force they could not fathom. With calm precision that belied the rage simmering beneath his skin, he moved to his locker, throwing open the steel door to reveal the arsenal within, gear meticulously maintained, weapons balanced like extensions of his own body, and the black fatigues that had carried him through the kind of missions the government would deny if asked. His brothers in arms used to joke that when he moved, the world bent around him. That when he set his eyes on a target, fate itself took a step back. Now, that focus had one name, one mission, one objective: Alicia. He didn't stop to call his commander, didn't pause to file reports. There were moments in life where bureaucracy had no place, and this was one of them. He slid into his vehicle, engine roaring like a beast unleashed, every mile between him and her a taunt he refused to tolerate. On the other end, she kept the line open, her heart aching with terror yet beating stronger with the knowledge that he had heard, that he was coming, and that the forest would soon learn the difference between cowards who prey on the vulnerable and a warrior who fights for love. The men circled Alicia like wolves that had finally trapped their prey, their laughter, echoing through the forest in a way that twisted the air into something darker than night itself. They toyed with her, one yanking her hair back until her neck strained painfully, another pressing the cold edge of a knife against her cheek as if daring her to flinch. They shouted at each other, voices overlapping in a chorus of malice, debating whether to leave her there as some cruel warning to others or to push their cruelty further. One of them sneered, leaning close enough that she could smell the stench of alcohol on his breath, taunting her with words designed to strip away dignity, calling her weak, calling her alone. But they didn't see the fire still smoldering in her eyes, even through the tears she fought to hold back. She wasn't broken, not yet. Because even tied to that tree, even with rope digging into her wrists until her fingers tingled from lack of circulation, she held on to one thought: he's coming. The phone, hidden against her side, was still connected, the line still open. Every insult, every cruel word, every mocking laugh was carried across the miles into the ear of the man who would never forgive such trespass. And on the road, that man was silence personified. His hands gripped the steering wheel like steel, clamps, eyes locked on the horizon, every calculation precise. His breathing was steady, his pulse controlled, but beneath it all churned a storm ready to unleash fury. Years of covert missions had honed him into something beyond ordinary. He could drive at high speed while memorizing routes, calculate distances, while loading magazines, and plan his approach as if he had already walked the battlefield. Yet this wasn't just a mission. This was his wife. Every mile marker passed like a drumbeat counting down to judgment. He remembered the first time he saw her, standing tall in a crowded room, her laughter cutting through the noise and drawing him in like gravity itself. He remembered her hand in his, the warmth that reminded him he was more than a soldier. He was a man with something to lose, something to protect. And as those memories fueled him, he pressed harder on the gas, weaving through traffic with lethal precision. Meanwhile, back at the tree, the gang grew restless. Their leader, a tall man, with scars carving lines across his cheek, stepped forward and raised a fist to silence the others. His eyes, hard and cruel, studied Alicia as if weighing her worth. "No one's coming for you," he muttered, his voice dripping with the kind of certainty only fools possess. "Out here, you're ours. Out here, you're nothing." He didn't. No, the phone was still live. He didn't know that every word sealed his fate. Alicia felt her heart tremble, but refused to look away, refused to give him the satisfaction of fear. Somewhere, in the silence between their words, she imagined the sound of an engine drawing nearer, the promise of boots hitting dirt, the whisper of branches giving way to the man who had walked through war zones and returned every time. The leader leaned closer, pressing the blade against the bark just beside her face, carving a line into the tree with a slow, deliberate scrape meant to remind her how fragile flesh could be. But in her silence, in her refusal to beg, he saw defiance, and it infuriated him. "Break her!" he growled to the others. Yet for every cruel hand that reached toward her, fate pulled the noose tighter around their own throats, because every second they spent believing she was theirs was a second closer to the moment when the woods would erupt, when they would learn the difference between a woman alone and a woman protected by a storm in human form. The roar of the engine cut across the long stretch of asphalt until he veered off toward the dirt roads that wound through the forest, dust billowing behind his vehicle like a trail of vengeance. His phone remained on the seat beside him, speaker active, carrying every vile laugh and every taunt the gang threw at Alicia. Each word was fuel poured onto a fire that already burned white-hot in his chest. He said nothing into the line because men like him knew silence was the loudest promise. They would not hear threats, they would not hear rage, they would not hear desperation. They would hear nothing until the moment his presence was carved into their reality, and then it would be too late. As he pulled off the road, he killed the engine, stepping out into the stillness of the trees. The forest air was sharp with pine and damp earth, the kind of scent he had breathed in 100 different terrains across the world, from Afghanistan's rugged mountains to jungles so thick that light never touched the ground. But here it was different. This was home soil. This was his wife. His boots sank lightly into the ground as he moved, body low, every muscle coiled tight with discipline and purpose. He popped open the trunk, his hands moving with a rhythm that was second nature, rifle assembled in seconds, sidearm loaded, extra magazines slipped into his vest, knife strapped to his thigh. He pulled on the black gloves that had seen countless operations, the material worn smooth from years of work that few could imagine, work that was never spoken of outside sealed rooms. His face hardened not into the mask of a soldier, but into something colder, something the world had whispered about in the corridors of special operations, a Delta operator on a personal mission. Every sound in the forest became a map, the distant flutter of birds startled by laughter, the faint crunch of boots pacing near the oak where they bound her, the occasional clang of metal as they brandished their weapons like children playing with fire. He slowed his breathing, his eyes narrowing, calculating distance and cover. He would approach not as a husband blinded by rage, but as a predator closing on prey. He could hear her now, faint and restrained, her voice carried through the phone still open in his pocket. Not words, not pleas, just the steadiness of her breath as she refused to give them her fear. He let that sound anchor him, sharpen him, remind him of why every step he took had to be perfect. In the distance, the gang had begun to escalate. their leader barking orders with a cruelty meant to impress his men, telling them to cut deeper into her pride, to strip her of any thought that she might be saved. One thug yanked her jacket open, laughing crudely as another raised his knife to carve a mark across the tree trunk above her head, promising that the next would be on her skin. She closed her eyes for just a moment, whispering silently for strength. And in that moment she thought of her husband's hands, steady, unyielding, the same hands that had held her through nights of storm. She didn't know how close he was, but somewhere deep inside she knew he was already there, already watching, already preparing to show these men what true fear looked like. His eyes tracked the movement of every target, his mind catalogued entry points and escape routes. His body merged into the shadow of the trees until he was a ghost. He was no longer just her husband. He was the reckoning they had invited without knowing, and the seconds they had left would soon fall away like grains of sand slipping through a fist. The forest grew strangely quiet, as if the very trees were, holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable collision of violence and justice. The men didn't notice at first. They were too busy jeering, their laughter ringing through the woods, their leader's voice barking commands like a drumbeat of cruelty. But nature always reacts to the predator, and soon even the gang began to sense the unease. A bird took flight from a nearby branch, wings thrashing against the air in a panic that seemed out of place. One of the younger men glanced around, frowning, his hand tightening on the grip of his pistol. "You hear that?" he muttered. The leader snarled at him, telling him to shut up, to focus on the woman tied to the tree. But the silence pressed heavier, every sound magnified, every step too loud. And then it happened, the first whisper of judgment. A twig snapped in the undergrowth, sharp and deliberate, and the gang froze. Guns were raised, eyes darted, but the forest gave them nothing back. Their leader sneered, muttering about animals, about nerves, but he could feel it too, that creeping sensation crawling up the back of his neck, the primal instinct that whispered they were no longer hunters, but prey. Alicia kept her gaze steady, her heart racing, because she recognized that silence. She knew it as surely as she knew the curve of her husband's jaw, the weight of his arms around her. He was here. Somewhere in the shadows, he was watching, and the gang, for all their numbers, for all their swagger, had no idea that they were already standing inside the kill box he had drawn around them. The first man to fall didn't even scream. One moment he was pacing near the edge of the clearing, peering into the dark, and the next a sharp whistle cut through the air as a knife buried itself in his throat. He collapsed instantly, clutching at the handle, eyes wide with shock as blood pooled against the roots of the tree. The others shouted, guns firing blindly into the night, but there was no target, only echoes and smoke. "Spread out!" the leader roared, but it was already too late. Another thug staggered back, choking, a silenced round having found the space between his ribs with surgical precision. Panic set in. Their bravado crumbled, replaced by the raw terror of men who realized the forest was no longer theirs. Alicia felt the rope cut into her wrists as she strained against it, adrenaline surging. Every fallen body was a reminder that she wasn't forgotten, that the promise made across vows and battlefields alike was being kept in blood. One man turned to run, crashing through the underbrush, but he hadn't taken 3 steps before a shadow detached itself from the trees and slammed him to the ground, a gloved hand snapping his neck with a crack that silenced the clearing. And then came the voice, low, controlled, vibrating with lethal certainty. "You should have never touched her." The gang froze, eyes wide, weapons trembling as they scanned the trees, but he had already melted back into the darkness. To them, he was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom striking from angles they couldn't defend. To Alicia, he was salvation wrapped in fury, the embodiment of love sharpened into a weapon. Her heartbeat synced with the chaos, tears streaking her, cheeks not from fear but from the overwhelming flood of relief. They thought they had tied her to a tree, But in truth, they had tied themselves to a reckoning that would not stop until every last one of them was buried in the silence of the forest floor. Gunfire erupted in desperate bursts, muzzle flashes, tearing through the night like dying flares, but each shot was wasted, each bullet swallowed by the dark. They were shooting at ghosts, at shadows that seemed to multiply with every second. Yet the truth was far worse. There was only one man, and that was enough. The leader barked orders, his voice cracking with forced authority, trying to herd his men into formation. But fear is stronger than discipline, and panic spread like wildfire through their ranks. One stumbled over a root, discharging his weapon into the sky before a round from the tree line punched clean through his chest, dropping him instantly. Another tried to flank, circling wide, but found only silence before a hand yanked him into the brush and the dull thud of a knife silenced his scream. The forest became a nightmare maze, every tree a threat, every rustle of leaves a countdown to death. Alicia twisted against the ropes, her arms aching, blood trickling where the cords had bitten deep into her skin. Yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from the chaos. She had seen her husband in uniforms, seen him in quiet moments of tenderness. But she had never seen this side of him unleashed, this storm that moved with surgical precision, dismantling an entire gang as if they were nothing more than poorly trained recruits in a drill. One man crept closer to her, his eyes wide with terror, clearly hoping to use her as a shield. He grabbed her arm roughly, pressing his pistol against her side as he shouted into the night, demanding her unseen savior reveal himself. For a moment, the clearing froze, the silence heavier than gunpowder, and then a single shot cracked from the shadows. The thug stiffened, the gun slipping from his fingers, a perfect hole drilled through the side of his head before he crumpled lifeless at her feet. The rope held her in place, but her spirit soared. He was close, closer than ever. His aim flawless, his protection absolute. The leader snarled, rage twisting his scarred face, and emptied his magazine into the tree line, cursing, threatening, demanding the intruder show himself. But the forest gave nothing back. The only answer came when another of his men spun, firing, wildly, only to be silenced by a round through his knee that dropped him screaming, followed by a second that ended him with merciful finality. "Cowards!" the leader spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. He turned to Alicia, pointing his gun at her temple, his hand shaking as he tried to cling to control. "You think he can save you? He's just one man!" Alicia locked eyes with him, defiance burning through her tears, and whispered, "One man is all it takes." The words seemed to echo, carried through the trees like a prophecy. And then he appeared, emerging from the shadows at last, his figure outlined by the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy. Dressed in black, rifle raised, eyes burning with lethal calm, he looked less like a husband and more like an executioner summoned by fate. The gang leader's bravado cracked for just a second, his mouth twitching as his finger hovered over the trigger. But hesitation is death against a man trained to erase hesitation from his soul. In a blur of motion, the Delta operator fired, the shot disarming him, the pistol flying from his hand with a spray of blood. The leader staggered back, cursing, holding his ruined hand as his men looked on in horror. One by one, they realized what Alicia had known all along. This was not a fight they could win. This was judgment. And it would be carried out with the precision of a man who had devoted his life to ensuring that evil never left the field standing. The clearing reeked of smoke, cordite, and fear. Bodies lay scattered across the forest floor, their arrogance silenced, their cruelty paid for in blood. Only the leader remained, staggering backward, clutching his ruined hand, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. His men were gone, the jeers that once filled the air replaced by groans of dying breath and the stillness of trees reclaiming their silence. Alicia's chest rose and fell rapidly, her arms screaming from the ropes that still bound her. But Her gaze was locked on the man who had thought he could own her, break her, erase her. He stumbled over roots, his bravado crumbling, and in a last surge of desperate rage, he lunged for her, grabbing a knife from one of his fallen comrades, raising it high as he shouted incoherently, as if by some miracle he could still seize victory. But the forest belonged to someone else now. Her husband moved like a phantom through the clearing, faster than the eye could follow, his rifle slung across his back as he closed the distance with nothing but fury and precision. The knife never touched her. In an instant, his gloved hand seized the leader's wrist, twisting with brutal efficiency until bones snapped and the blade clattered uselessly to the ground. The leader screamed, swinging wildly with his other fist, but his blows landed on a wall of steel. A knee drove into his gut, folding him over, and then a savage elbow crushed across his face, sending him sprawling to the dirt, coughing blood, into the earth. The Delta operator stood above him, every breath measured, every movement controlled, yet the rage in his eyes promised this man would not walk away. "You tied the wrong woman to the wrong tree," he growled, voice low enough to chill the night itself. The leader spat blood, glaring up with the last shred of defiance he could muster, but his bravado shattered when a boot pinned his chest, pressing him into the dirt like the insect he was. For a long, tense moment, the clearing held its breath, Alicia, watching, the forest silent, the broken man beneath him wheezing, waiting for the final judgment. But instead of a bullet, instead of a knife, her husband leaned down close, his voice cold and merciless. "You live with this. You live with knowing. You faced me and you broke." Then, with one brutal strike, he knocked the man unconscious, leaving him sprawled in the dirt, stripped of his power, his cruelty silenced not by death, but by defeat, so crushing it would haunt him forever. The forest seemed to exhale as he turned, moving swiftly to Alicia, his hands trembling only now as they pulled at the knots, cutting the ropes until they fell away. Her body sagged forward into his arms, and for the first time that night, she let herself collapse, burying her face against his chest, sobs shaking her frame. His arms wrapped around her, holding her as tightly as if letting go would mean the world might steal her again. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice breaking in the quiet, softer than she'd ever heard it, the storm within him finally calmed by the simple truth of her heartbeat against his own. They stood there for what felt like eternity, surrounded by the silence of the forest, until finally he pulled back, brushing a tear from her cheek. "No one will ever touch you again," he vowed, and in that moment she believed it with every fiber of her being. The clearing, once filled with cruelty and arrogance, was now a graveyard of shattered men and a monument to love's unbreakable bond. Together, hand in hand, they stepped out of the shadows, leaving the forest behind. For Alicia, the nightmare would scar her, but it would never define her. For him, the mission was over, but the vow was eternal. And for the world, it was a reminder that sometimes, when evil dares to strike the innocent, one call is all it takes to summon a force so relentless, so unstoppable that no darkness can withstand it.